John stood frozen in the hospital corridor, the sterile white walls pressing closer with each second. His chest felt like it was collapsing, suffocating him under a truth he wasn't ready to hear. The doctor's words echoed, shattering his fragile hope. John said, "Please, there must be something you can do." His voice trembled, breaking into pieces with each syllable. The doctor's eyes lowered, heavy with pity, and in that silence, John's world unraveled. He wanted to scream, to fight, but all he could do was watch helplessly as despair swallowed him whole. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting shadows across his weary face. His fists clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms until it hurt. Tears stung, but he refused to let them fall. Inside, however, he already knew. He was losing her, and no prayer could rewrite what fate had written. He whispered to himself, "I can't lose her, not like this." But even as he said it, he felt the cruel weight of inevitability pressing harder against his heart. John walked into the dimly lit hospital room, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something heavier, the scent of loss waiting to strike. Sarah lay still on the bed, fragile and pale, her breath shallow and uneven. Machines hummed softly, each beep slicing into his chest like a blade. John whispered, "I'm here, Sarah. I won't leave you." His voice cracked, betraying the fear he tried to bury. He pulled a chair close, his hand trembling as he reached for hers. Her skin felt cold, fragile like porcelain, and the touch made his stomach churn with dread. Sarah opened her eyes briefly, the faintest smile breaking across her lips. She said, "You're late, John." He forced a broken laugh, trying to hide the pain swelling in his throat. For a moment, he let himself believe she would be fine, but the tubes and monitors screamed otherwise. Deep down he knew time was slipping away faster than he could grasp. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each sound hammering into John's chest. He couldn't look away from Sarah, afraid she might disappear if his eyes shifted even for a second. John whispered, "I'm so sorry for everything I couldn't give you." His voice cracked as the guilt poured out, heavy and suffocating. He thought of the promises he had made, the life they dreamed of, the laughter they shared on summer nights. Sarah's lips parted, barely audible. "You gave me enough." Her words pierced him, soft but shattering. He wanted to believe her, but the truth clawed at him. The silence of the room weighed heavier than any scream, broken only by the beeping machine. His fingers clutched hers tighter, as though his grip could tether her to life. John said softly, "I can't lose you. Not now." The walls felt like they were closing in, the reality of her fading presence pressing him into despair he could not escape. The memory of their first meeting flashed in John's mind, cutting through the sterile silence of the room. He remembered Sarah laughing at his clumsy words in a crowded cafe, her eyes sparkling with life. That same spark was now dim, flickering like a dying flame. John whispered, "Do you remember the cafe on 5th Street?" His lips curved into a trembling smile. Sarah's weak nod was almost imperceptible, but her eyes softened at the memory. She said, "You spilled coffee all over yourself." John chuckled through tears, his voice rough, "And you still agreed to see me again." That memory warmed him for a moment, but it hurt more knowing that those days were slipping away forever. The sound of her uneven breathing dragged him back into the present. The past and present collided painfully, reminding him that joy was just a memory, and sorrow was now his reality. John's shoulders slumped, the weight of the world pressing against him as he rested his forehead on Sarah's hand. His tears fell silently, soaking into her skin as he whispered, "I don't know how to live without you." Sarah's faint grip tightened slightly, her strength nearly gone but her love still there. She whispered, "You'll find a way." The words struck him like lightning, painful, inevitable, undeniable. His heart screamed that he couldn't, that life without her was unimaginable. But her eyes, though tired, carried the quiet certainty of someone who knew. John raised his head, looking into her fading gaze, his soul unraveling under the truth she carried. He wanted to beg, to fight, to scream at the cruelty of it all. Instead, he said softly, "I'll hold on if only for you." And in that fragile moment, surrounded by sterile walls and flickering lights, he realized love meant facing the unbearable, even when it tore him apart. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds of the hospital room, casting pale stripes across Sarah's fragile face. John sat by her side, exhaustion painted on every line of his features. He hadn't left her side in days, his body aching, but his heart refused to let go. He whispered, "Remember when we used to walk by the lake every Sunday?" His words trembled, clinging to memories like lifelines. Sarah's lips curved faintly, though her voice was too soft to carry. John imagined her laughter, the sound that once filled his world. The room was quiet, except for the hum of machines, a cruel reminder of how fragile life had become. He looked at her hands, once so warm and strong, now cold and delicate. His chest tightened. "I should have taken you there more often," he said, guilt pressing into him. He longed for those simple days, and the thought of never having them again carved him open with unbearable pain. The nurse entered quietly, adjusting Sarah's the fourth as John stood to the side, watching with weary eyes. He hated feeling powerless, his love reduced to silent prayers. The nurse gave him a sympathetic look, but words seemed useless in the heavy air. John's voice was hoarse as he whispered to Sarah, "I wish I could take this pain away." Sarah blinked slowly, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and sorrow. Her lips moved, whispering faintly, "You already have, just by being here." The words struck him, both healing and breaking him. He felt his knees weaken but forced himself to stay upright. The nurse checked the monitors, the beeps filling the silence like a cruel clock counting down. John sat again, his hands shaking as he reached for Sarah's fragile fingers. "I'll never leave you," he murmured. The promise felt both comforting and terrifying, because deep inside he feared he would be left behind instead. John stepped into the hallway, his legs heavy as though dragging chains. He pressed his back against the wall, burying his face in his hands. The sterile air suffocated him, each breath a battle against despair. He remembered Sarah's words, her quiet courage even as her body failed her. "How does she stay so strong?" he whispered to himself, the sound barely audible. His chest burned, his throat tightening with unshed tears. He thought about the life they had planned, the house they wanted, the children they dreamed of, the endless summers they would never have. The thought crushed him. Passing orderly glanced at him with pity, but John quickly looked away, ashamed of his brokenness. He muttered, "I have to be strong for her," but his voice cracked, betraying the lie. He felt smaller than ever, yet somehow the weight of Sarah's hope still demanded that he stand tall. Later that night, John sat in the hospital chapel, the dim glow of candles flickering across the room. His hands clasped tightly, knuckles white, though he hadn't prayed in years. He whispered, "If there's anyone listening, please don't take her from me." His voice cracked, echoing softly in the stillness. The stained glass windows cast fractured colors across his face, making his grief look like shattered pieces of light. He bowed his head, trembling, as guilt gnawed at him. He thought of missed moments, careless arguments, and how he had taken her laughter for granted. "I should have loved her better," he muttered, tears spilling freely now. The silence of the chapel felt crushing, like heaven itself refused to answer. Yet in the quiet, he clung to one thing, the hope that Sarah still felt his love, even if it was too late to change the past. John returned to Sarah's room, his eyes swollen from tears, his body drained. He sat down quietly, afraid to wake her, but her eyes opened softly as if she had been waiting. She smiled weakly and said, "You've been crying." He chuckled bitterly, brushing his face with the back of his hand. "You always see through me," he whispered. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for his, her fragile fingers curling around his knuckles. "Don't hide from me, John," she said, her breath weak but steady. The words pierced him. He leaned closer, forehead touching hers, his tears falling again. "I don't know how to be strong," he admitted, voice breaking. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered, Just love me. That's enough. The simplicity of her words broke him, yet they stitched something back together. In that fragile moment, John realized love was all that remained, and it was everything. The days blurred together as John sat endlessly by Sarah's bedside, every hour filled with the rhythmic beeping of machines that mocked his helplessness. He had stopped counting the hours of lost sleep, his body running on sheer will, alone. Shadows deepened beneath his eyes, the weight of grief pressing heavier with each passing day. He whispered, "Why can't I fix this? Why can't love be enough?" His voice broke, his words spilling into the silence. Sarah turned her weak gaze toward him, her lips parting slightly, though her breath rattled with effort. She said faintly, "You're here, John. That's all I need." Her words were fragile but steady, like the last light of a fading candle. John felt his chest tighten as tears welled up, yet he forced himself to smile through the ache. He knew her strength was dwindling, but her love still burned, keeping him tethered to her even as everything else slipped away. John's mind drifted as he stared at the ceiling, memories colliding with the present. He remembered the time Sarah danced barefoot in their living room, her laughter echoing through the night like music. Now, the silence screamed louder than any song. He said softly, "Do you remember the night we stayed up until sunrise, just talking?" Sarah's eyes opened faintly, and she gave a weak nod, whispering, "You promised me forever." His throat closed as the words echoed in his head, heavy with cruel irony. He wanted to answer but couldn't. His silence was enough to tell her that forever had already begun to slip through his fingers. He buried his face into her hand, inhaling her faint scent, as though trying to memorize every piece of her before it was gone. "I'm still promising you," he finally muttered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it anymore. The doctor entered again, clipboard in hand, his expression grim. John rose instantly, his pulse racing as though bracing for another blow. "Tell me she's improving," he demanded, though his voice carried more desperation than conviction. The doctor paused, his silence heavy before finally speaking. "We're doing everything we can, but her body isn't responding the way we hope." John's stomach plummeted as though the floor had vanished beneath him. He clenched his fists, anger and grief boiling together. "There has to be more. Something, anything," he said sharply, his voice cracking. The doctor shook his head, his eyes filled with pity, but words offered no comfort. John collapsed back into the chair, burying his face in his hands, as the machines kept their steady rhythm, indifferent to his despair. The world outside the hospital carried on. But for John, everything was collapsing inward, leaving only silence and sorrow. That night, John stepped outside the hospital for the first time in days. The cold air bit his skin, sharp and unforgiving, yet it felt like the only thing keeping him from shattering. The city lights blurred as his vision clouded with tears. He sat on a bench, staring at the sky where stars fought to break through the haze. "Why her?" he whispered bitterly, his voice shaking with rage and despair. He thought about the countless prayers he had offered, every silent plea falling on deaf ears. His fists slammed against the bench as his body trembled. He wanted to scream at the universe, to tear it apart for its cruelty, but the night swallowed his cries. A stranger passing by glanced at him, pity flickering in their eyes before they walked away, leaving John drowning in solitude. For the first time he felt completely abandoned. When John returned to Sarah's room, she was awake, her eyes following him with quiet understanding. She said softly, "You needed air." He froze, guilt weighing on him, but she smiled faintly. "I know when you're hurting." He sat beside her, his voice trembling. "I don't want to let you go." Sarah's hand brushed weakly against his cheek, her touch feather-light. "Then don't. Just hold me while you can," she whispered. His chest constricted as tears streamed freely. He leaned forward, wrapping her gently in his arms, terrified of breaking her fragile frame. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breathing uneven but steady. In that embrace, John realized time was slipping too quickly, but love still tethered them together. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the world had stopped, and all that mattered was the warmth of her fragile body against his breaking heart. John sat in silence, his mind unraveling as the monitors beeped steadily beside Sarah. He tried to breathe, but every inhale felt like glass scraping against his lungs. The weight of helplessness pressed down heavier than ever. He whispered, "Why do I feel like I'm failing you?" His voice cracked with despair. Sarah turned her head slowly, her lips trembling into a faint smile. "You're not failing me," she whispered, her voice fragile but filled with certainty. The words should have soothed him, but instead they pierced him deeper, because he knew she was the one being strong for him. His heart screamed in protest. He wanted to fix it all, to trade places, to steal her pain away. Instead, he sat there, powerless, drowning in the truth that love couldn't stop what was coming. His tears slipped down silently, and he leaned forward, resting his head beside her hand, as though clinging to the last anchor in a storm. The hours passed slowly, and John's thoughts spiraled into dark corners he had avoided for years. He thought about the arguments they had, the days he had chosen work over her laughter, and the moments when he failed to say the words she needed most. His chest tightened with guilt, regret gnawing at his soul. "I should have loved you better," he confessed softly, his voice breaking. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, heavy with fatigue but shining with tenderness. "You loved me the best way you knew how," she whispered. John shook his head, his tears spilling freely. "It wasn't enough," he muttered, his body trembling with grief. Sarah's weak hand brushed against his, grounding him. "It was everything," she said, her voice faint yet resolute. He broke into sobs, realizing that even in her final moments, she carried more strength than he ever could. John stepped into the restroom, his reflection staring back from the cracked mirror. He barely recognized himself, eyes red, skin pale, hair disheveled. He gripped the sink, his knuckles white, as his breath came in ragged bursts. "You're falling apart," he whispered to himself. His voice trembled, breaking in the still air. He slammed his fist against the counter, the sound echoing like a scream. His chest heaved, and he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, the silence suffocating. He thought of Sarah's fading smile, of the way her eyes still searched for him with love, even as life drained from her body. He whispered, "She deserves better than this broken man?" Tears blurred his vision, but he let them fall freely this time, no longer pretending to be strong. His pain filled the room, yet somewhere deep inside, a small voice told him he had to endure for her. When John returned to the room, Sarah's breathing had grown shallower, each inhale sounding like a battle. His heart seized in terror, and he rushed to her side. "Stay with me, please," he whispered desperately, his hand clutching hers. Sarah opened her eyes slightly, her lips parting with effort. "I'm still here," she murmured faintly, her words a fragile thread holding him together. John's throat burned as he tried to hold back his sobs. He pressed her hand against his cheek, whispering, "I don't know how to live without you." Sarah's gaze softened, though her eyelids trembled with exhaustion. "You'll learn," she said, her breath shaky. The words sliced through him like a blade, leaving him both broken and in awe of her quiet strength. He leaned down, resting his forehead against hers, silently begging for time that he knew was running out too fast. The nurse quietly entered to check Sarah's vitals, her presence breaking the fragile stillness. John stepped back reluctantly, his hand sliding from Sarah's with reluctance carved into every motion. He stood by the wall, watching as the nurse adjusted the machines. The steady beeps filled the silence, each one echoing like a countdown. His chest tightened as he realized how fragile every second had become. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes tired but still searching for his. She whispered, "Don't leave me alone tonight." John's heart cracked at the plea. He stepped forward quickly, nodding. "I'll stay right here." His voice trembled, but his resolve was firm. The nurse gave him a quiet nod before leaving. John pulled his chair closer, gripping Sarah's hand once more, determined not to let go. As he sat in the dim room, he realized that sometimes the greatest act of love was simply refusing to leave. The doctor asked John to step into the consultation room, and the world tilted again. The blinds sliced the light into bars, and he felt caged by what he could not change. John said, "Just tell me what to sign to help her," though dread rose sharp. The doctor's voice softened, careful like glass handled with gloves. He said, "Sarah signed a DNR last week and requested comfort care only." The words fell like stones, heavy, final, impossible to throw back. John stared at the form, breath narrowing into cold knives. He whispered, "She didn't tell me," and hurt bloomed where hope had lived. The doctor said, "She wanted to spare you another round of false hope." Anger flared, then faltered, because that sounded like Sarah's brave kindness. John pressed his eyes shut as the vent hummed a tired, endless note. He said, "I should have seen the courage inside her silence," and the room steadied. John returned to Sarah, carrying the weight like wet iron. He sat beside her and said, "You signed it." The words broke as they left him. Sarah blinked slowly, finding his face with a tired smile. She said, "I wanted your days to be gentler than mine." He swallowed and felt the floor slide again. "I should have known," he said, voice raw with love and fear. Sarah's fingers searched for his and held, soft as paper. She whispered, "You gave me Sundays, and I wanted to give you mercy." The machines murmured, counting moments like small coins. He wanted to argue with fate, but her eyes asked him to stay. "I'm angry because I love you," he said, and the anger folded into grief. She breathed, "Then love me by letting this be enough," and he nodded, breaking quietly. John opened Sarah's canvas tote to fetch a sweater and found a sealed envelope. The word, "Sundays," curved across it in her looping hand. His breath stalled as he tore it carefully. The letter carried her summer voice into winter air. She wrote, "I felt the first warnings long before I told you." He gripped the page as guilt rose like tide. She wrote, "I hid it until your launch was done so you could finish proud." The memory of that night brightened and then burned. John said, "You carried this alone," and his chest ached with helpless love. She wrote, "If pain steals my days, please don't let it steal your life." The paper trembled in his shaking hands, but the words stood steady. He folded the letter like a vow and whispered, "I'll honor the Sundays you save." John read the letter aloud in whispers, and Sarah listened with closed eyes. He said, "You knew a year ago." The words hurt, but they carried respect. Sarah nodded faintly, breath thin but certain. She said, "An experimental trial would keep me here but not myself." The honesty struck like thunder wrapped in light. John reached her cheek and said, "You chose to stay you, even if shorter." She smiled, a fragile sunrise across pale skin. "I wanted you to remember me laughing, not lost," she said gently. He felt pride rise beside sorrow, two tides in one moon. "Then I will keep the real you," he promised, voice steadying. The room felt holy with ordinary light, and he bowed his head to it. Morning crept in gray and kind. John met the doctor in the doorway and said, "We choose comfort." The words felt like surrender and like love. The doctor nodded, and the machine's alarms softened quiet margins. John returned with a small speaker and played lake sounds, gentle water on stone. "One more Sunday," he said, placing it near her shoulder. Sarah's lips curved, a shore-finding tide. "Stay," she breathed, and he did, anchoring her hand in both of his. The nurse dimmed the lights, and the room became a sanctuary of breath. John said, "I will not rush this goodbye," and time seemed to loosen its grip. He rested his forehead to hers, letting the small waves hold them. The day waited with them, unafraid and unbearably tender. The morning crept in pale, painting Sarah's face with soft light. John sat at her side, heart pounding as each breath she took seemed thinner than the last. He whispered, "I don't know how to let go." His voice trembled with fear and love intertwined. Sarah's weak eyes met his, carrying more strength than her body could hold. "You already know how," she whispered faintly, each word a struggle. John shook his head, tears streaming freely. "No, I only know how to hold on." Her fingers twitched in his hand, fragile but determined. "Then hold on," she said, "until it's time." The room grew unbearably still, machines humming softly, a cruel countdown to the inevitable. John lowered his forehead against her hand, his chest breaking open with grief. He whispered, "I love you more than this life," as though the words themselves could fight back the silence waiting in the wings. John leaned closer, his voice trembling like a candle in wind. "Do you remember the lake?" he asked softly. Sarah's lips curved faintly, her eyelids fluttering as if recalling the sound of rippling water. "Yes," she whispered, "the ducks chased us for bread." John laughed through his tears, the sound jagged and broken. "I would give anything to be there again," he admitted. Sarah's gaze softened, her breath shallow but steady. "We are there," she said, her words barely audible. "Because you're holding me." The simplicity of her truth struck him harder than any grand speech. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of their Sundays wash over him, the laughter, the touch, the sunlight on her hair. He whispered, "Then let this be our last Sunday." She gave a faint nod, her fragile smile lingering like light refusing to fade. The nurse quietly entered, checking the monitors as John kept his gaze locked on Sarah. He barely noticed the adjustments, his world narrowed to her fading breaths. The nurse glanced at him, compassion in her eyes, before silently stepping back. John leaned closer, whispering, "If love could save you, you'd live forever." His voice cracked into silence. Sarah's hand trembled as she squeezed his fingers weakly. "Then I already have," she whispered, her words drifting like fragile wings. His tears blurred her face, but he etched every line into memory, refusing to forget. The machine beeped softly, steady but slowing. He pressed her hand against his chest, desperate to merge her heartbeat with his. "Don't go yet," he begged, voice shaking. She whispered, "I'll always be here," and her eyes closed briefly, her body fighting to stay. John sobbed quietly, his soul unraveling in the stillness of her courage. Hours dragged like years, each minute marked by the slowing rhythm of Sarah's breath. John sat unmoving, afraid that if he blinked, she would vanish. His throat burned, his chest heavy with despair. He whispered, "I don't want to say goodbye." Sarah's lips parted slowly, her voice barely audible. "Then don't say goodbye, say thank you." The words cut through him, tender yet devastating. "Thank you for what?" he asked, tears spilling. She gave the faintest smile. "For loving me enough to stay." His body trembled as he leaned closer, his tears dripping onto her hand. He whispered, "Then thank you for teaching me what love means." She closed her eyes, her chest rising shallowly. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, as though everything waited for one final moment of grace. The night returned, quiet and heavy, wrapping the room in stillness. John sat holding Sarah, her hand nestled in his, her breaths faint but steady. He whispered, "If I could trade places, I would in a heartbeat." His voice cracked into silence. Sarah's eyelids fluttered, her faint smile carrying peace. "You already gave me everything," she said softly. John broke into sobs, pressing her hand against his lips. "I'm not ready," he confessed, his words broken. She whispered, "You never will be." The truth hit like lightning, both cruel and kind. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, whispering, "Then let me love you until the end." Her breathing slowed, fragile like the last flicker of a flame. John closed his eyes, holding her tightly, as though the strength of his arms could stop the inevitable. The room held the sacred weight of goodbye unspoken. The night was unbearably quiet, the machines slowing to a hollow rhythm. John leaned close, holding Sarah's hand tightly. "Stay with me," he whispered, but her breaths grew shallower. Sarah's lips parted faintly. "I'll always be with you," she breathed, her voice fragile as a thread. Tears slipped down John's cheeks, and he pressed his forehead to hers. "I can't let you go," he said, breaking inside. Her faint smile told him she already had. The monitor beeped slower, time stretching painfully. John's heart pounded, but her hand weakened in his. The silence grew heavy, until only love filled the room. The final beep echoed, sharp and cruel, then silence followed. John's body shook as he clutched Sarah's hand, refusing to let go. "No, no, please," he whispered, his tears falling like rain. The stillness in her chest confirmed the truth he couldn't bear to face. The world outside continued, indifferent, but for John, everything ended in that breathless second. He kissed her cold hand, sobbing into it, whispering, "I love you." The nurse entered softly, eyes filled with sorrow, but John waved her away. He wasn't ready. He wanted just one more moment, one more touch, one more heartbeat. The nurse returned gently, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "It's time," she said softly. John shook his head, his grip tightening around Sarah's fingers. "Not yet," he whispered, voice trembling with desperation. His heart knew she was gone, but his soul rebelled. The nurse's eyes glistened, but she stayed quiet, honoring his grief. John leaned down, kissing Sarah's forehead, whispering, "Thank you for loving me." The words cracked as they left his lips. He finally released her hand, fingers trembling as he pulled away. The silence left behind was unbearable, but her presence lingered in every breath of his broken heart. John walked into the hallway, his legs weak, the world around him a blur. Families spoke in hushed voices, doctors passed briskly, but he heard nothing. He carried an emptiness too vast for sound. He whispered to himself, "She's gone," as though saying it would make it real. His chest ached, and his hands trembled. He sat against the cold wall, burying his face in his palms, sobbing quietly. Strangers passed, some glancing, some looking away, but none could feel the storm inside him. For John, time had stopped, and he was left stranded in grief, clutching memories like lifelines. Days later, John stood by the lake where they had spent countless Sundays. The water rippled gently, reflecting the golden dusk. He whispered, "You're still here," as though the breeze carried her presence. He closed his eyes, remembering her laughter, her hand in his, her smile brighter than sunlight. Tears streamed, but a fragile peace followed. He said, "I'll carry you in every breath," his voice steady despite the ache. The pain would never fade, but love remained, eternal and unshaken. As the sun sank, John placed a single white flower on the water, watching it drift away, carrying her memory with the current.